We're going to that down. Okay, well, everybody, welcome to today's webinar. My name is Jeff Mao, and I'm the Executive Director at Vita-Learn. And I am joined here by Reg Leichty. And Reg and I go back, we were just commenting, a couple of years in working in a variety of different policy settings. And he is here today to kind of help us wade through the ECF, the Emergency Connectivity Fund, and kind of what it is. Before we get into that, maybe Reg, you want to kind of introduce yourself and let folks know a little bit about yourself so they kind of know where you're coming from as you share this information.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jeff. And good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for inviting me to talk with you. I am DC based, live across the river in Virginia. I'm the co-founder of a small law firm called Foresight Law and Policy, and we work kind of across the country with state departments of ed and school districts and others, and do a lot of work in DC, on Capitol Hill, at the Department of Ed, at the FCC for education associations and others. Do a lot of work with COSIN, which brings me here today, and CETA as well. And happy to have this chance to talk with you a little bit about the Emergency Connectivity Fund. Thanks.
Excellent. All right. So just to start off, and for those of you who are looking for slides, we do have a slide deck that I'll make available to you for download, but it's really just kind of a bunch of bullet points, as most slides typically are, and we thought it might be a little easier to see us. You look at our wonderful faces here, but I think a little bit easier to kind of listen to than a disembodied voice over a slide. So, but Reg, if you could just start kind of explain a little bit about what is the actual fund, what is this Emergency Connectivity Fund, and I know it's connected in some way, shape, or form to E-rate. If you could kind of explain how its connection to E-rate and why it's the same, but why it's not the same. Like what's the same, what's not.
Yeah, glad to kick off with that. And just to give you a little context, so the legislative work on this program started, back in the spring of 2020. As all schools moved, or almost all schools moved to a virtual environment. The calls that a number of us had been making for years to better connect students to broadband at home suddenly took on a new resonance. And for almost a year, Congress debated whether they should do that, how they should do that. And during that time, there's a lot of conversation about simply giving E-rate some additional money and a broader mandate. There were a number of legislative proposals that were put on the table. So, the two programs really were conflated during the debate, but hopefully we can provide a little bit of clarity about the distinction today. So the ECF was finally approved by Congress in March of this year as part of a giant bill called the American Rescue Plan Act. I'm sure you've heard a lot about ARP because of the school district funding provided by that package through the ESSER program, which was super flexible and great for technology as well. But the Emergency Connectivity Fund was a dedicated amount of money, about $7.1 billion, just to connect students and staff, educational staff, as well as library patrons, to both broadband and devices at home. So that's the first big distinction with E-rate. E-rate, of course, can only be used for connecting school buildings and campuses, classrooms, of course, to wireless access points. This is the second piece of that puzzle to say, how do we make sure that our lower income populations or other parts of the student population that maybe live in more isolated areas that have super high costs for some of these things have this access for learning. And so the program adopted a lot of some of the E-rate practices that the community is familiar with. And I think that was a positive step. So rather than recreate the wheel around definitions and a lot of things, they do draw on E-rate. It's administered by the Universal Service Administrative Company, as E-rate is. Some of, E-rate eligibility is the baseline eligibility for this program as well, but they are distinct programs. The funding does not flow through E-rate accounts. The application requirements of E-rate generally do not apply either. So you see people talking about the programs a lot interchangeably, but I think the easiest way to think about it is that ECF draws on some of the best kind of aspects or the most common aspects of E-rate to try to make it as easy as possible to get these funds out the door.
Okay, great. So you just mentioned eligibility is pretty much exactly the same as E-rate. It's schools and libraries, right? In the same way. So it's both public schools, private schools.
Yep, and consortia thereof. It really follows the E-rate model. The only private schools that are excluded are for-profit entities. Okay. And that's the same as E-rate. And then, if you have an endowment of $50 million or more, you're also not eligible.
Okay. And there's probably not that many of those.
Not a lot of schools.
Not a lot of schools at the $50 million endowment level. Yeah. And so, as you mentioned that, this is really about kind of connectivity outside of the school building and outside of the school campus. So what are the common uses? I mean, is it just connectivity, but it's also, there's devices and things, right?
Yeah, I think Congress sort of recognized straight away that, we need broadband connections in a lot of households, but in order to take advantage of them, you have to have a connected device. So the program allows investments in, connected laptops, internet connected tablets, Wi-Fi hotspots, as well as providing funding for the broadband connection itself.
Okay. And then within that, then are there, like I've heard this term of unmet need, and that seems to be one of the kind of real critical pieces of this. Is it only for someone who, doesn't have a device, or what about school systems that have, say, one-to-one programs, but they're at the point where they need to refresh, or they're just simply short devices, or, how do we define this unmet need?
Yeah, so the FCC really wanted to use this program to try to close as many gaps as possible. And, because it came sort of 12 or 13 months into the, national emergency, the global emergency, a lot of efforts were made to connect students during that time. But the FCC said, we're still not there. And so we're going to try to direct applicants to focus on that unmet need. And so there are, some prohibitions built in. For example, if a household is receiving a broadband connection using some CARES Act funding that was directed there by the district, or the Emergency Broadband Benefit Program, which is another pot of funds that Congress provided for broadband for low-income families. You can't duplicate that use by investing ECF resources in those things. But for example, the EBB program, will expire. If a household's losing a connection, that would still be considered an unmet need. If the device was not sufficient for delivering online instruction, including video, I think that would be considered an unmet need. They are leaving a lot of this to the interpretation of the district, but asking in the application process to make a reasonable estimate about what the unmet need was kind of before the pandemic, kind of now, and then how the investment that's requested by an applicant will help address that gap. So that's the kind of thing you should expect as you look at the application.
Okay, so applicants are now going to be expected to then submit a little bit of kind of justification or proof as to how they define this notion of unmet need. And that might be, I surveyed my families to find out who had connectivity or not. Or it might be that they said, well, in our system, we've decided that in order to provide the educational services we want to provide, everyone needs to have the same device. And so we're starting this one-to-one program, or simply my one-to-one program, it turns out all the devices aged out. They're 5 years old and we need to replace them anyway.
Yeah.
And so, but they need to be the same so that they can all have the same software, the same security settings, works on our online, state assessment system, blah, blah, all these various things. And so it isn't purely this notion that, well, that guy I know has a computer at home because he's a geek and he happens to have a device for every kid that he bought on his own at the family level.
Mhm.
But that's not what we do for my school.
That's right. You described it well. And the commission kind of repeatedly used this sort of idea of a best estimate.
Yeah.
And I think the types of steps you described are really good. And you can mix and match. If you need a broadband connection in one place, that's fine. If you need a device in another household, that's fine too. There are limits. You can have one connection per household and one device per student. But that seems like a fair kind of requirement to apply to the system.
Now, if you have, so one nuance there, if and you can help clarify this, I thought I had heard if you're getting connectivity and let's say there's 3 kids in the house and it's wireline, like cable broadband, you get one connection. But if it turns out that the connectivity you're bringing is a hotspot, do you need one per student, or is it just, do they share the one hotspot?
Oh, you know what, Jeff, I need to clarify that one. That's in the FAQs, but I don't want to give the group the wrong answer to that. I know that there are several questions in the FCC's FAQs, which you can find, Jeff mentioned the document we'll post has some links to those materials. Just don't want to lead the group down the wrong path on that one.
So, but I'm quite certain, obviously, if it's a wireline, it's one. You're not going to get one per
I think,
kid.
yeah, that's right. I think that's right.
But there may be a nuance on the hotspot side, particularly because hotspots move around. And so, of course, if the eldest son goes somewhere with it, then it leaves the rest.
And I think you're right. I think the one device per student phrase is not just tablet or a laptop, but also that Wi-Fi hotspot.
Yeah,
I think that's right.
And then, so one of the questions that I know has come up from folks when I've talked about this is, there's this unending fear, which, is built on a little bit of experience, I think, from some people, and a lot of bit of just kind of urban legend of audits on E-rate stuff, going back how many numbers of years. In this case, my sense is when you put an application, you have to kind of be a little bit more explicit than what we used to do with E-rate, where you just kind of say, I'm bringing connectivity, but and then later on you would go out to bid and someone would, you win the bid and so on and so forth. This is kind of like saying, well, I need 17 connections because I pulled my kids and here's the justification, or I need 100 devices and this is my justification for why. And so you're kind of front loading it. And if then approved, it seems like there shouldn't be as much kind of fear about somehow the hammer coming down later that, well, that's not approved now.
I think that's right. I think you want to create, a clear record, a clear file about how you came to the estimate that you developed, that best estimate that the FCC asked for. And then they do ask you to maintain those records for 10 years. I think that, kind of spooks some people, but I think not sort of something that's surprising given requirements for other federal programs. So again, provide a basis for what you're doing, follow the documentation kind of requirements in the application in terms of where the device is assigned and to whom and all that, and then keep it somewhere safe for 10 years and you'll be in good shape.
Yeah. So it from my perspective, it does seem a little bit clearer because you are front loading it with so much more justification rather than later trying to prove, no, I really needed to have 100 megabits in that building.
Yeah.
And having them say, well, but you only said this or what, Now, the other thing I noticed is there is a cap built in. I think it's $400 for devices. And I want to say it's $250 for the connectivity. Is that right?
Oh, it's so for the laptops and tablets, it's $400. That's the cap on the subsidy you receive. So if you want to go out and buy a MacBook Pro for $1,500, that's okay. You just can't expect to get more than the $400 from the program. The $250 is the cap for the individual student Wi-Fi hotspot. If you want to use this program to connect buses, that individual $250 cap doesn't apply in that context. That includes both, for buses in transit or, parked buses in neighborhoods if you're trying to deliver Wi-Fi that way. There is an exception built in. So there was a debate during the rulemaking about the devices required to serve some students with disabilities, and that a more expensive subsidy might be appropriate in that context. They do provide in this program a waiver process for that. So if you wanted to go out and try to get a little more subsidy for serving your students with disabilities, that's allowed. I haven't yet heard of anyone that's gone through that process, but it does exist.
Okay. And so that's that again, you're putting it into the application. And so then you'll actually be notified in hopefully your approval letter that yes, this has been approved, in which case then you can go forward. With it, if it happens to be extra subsidy, maybe a student who's visually impaired needs JAWS software and that costs another $1,000 or whatever.
Yeah. Oh, and Jeff, I'm sorry I didn't answer your full question. For the broadband connection itself, it has to be, what the FCC is saying is a reasonable reimbursement. And they provide in the kind of materials this, they say, generally that might be $10 to $25 per connection, but I think they recognize that it might be higher, right? Given a certain household's location or need. So that's a reasonableness test. And they're going to tell you in the application whether or not you're being, if they think you're not being reasonable with some of your connections, they'll tell you before they approve.
Okay. Right. So pulling fiber to everyone home is probably not reasonable. It'd be nice,
Yeah.
but yeah. On the procurement side of things, my understanding is, and tell me if this is what you understand, that for schools, like if you're out buying devices or you're looking to buy hotspots or things, you need to follow whatever state procurement rules may be in place in your state and any local guidelines that you have, but there isn't like a 470 process like we do with E-rate.
Right? Yeah, no 470. One of the first steps in the application process is they, ask you to look at your state or local procurement rules, whether there are any. And also, one addition to that would be for any kind of tribal government procurement rules too.
Okay. I can see, I'll throw this in there. A question here was asking about bundled services with things like laptops. I know that one question in the chat is about MDM licenses, but I've also heard questions about things like, say, extended warranties and other things like that. Is there an allowance for those kind of extended services, or is it?
Yeah, for things bundled like licenses, software, security, filtering, as long as it's bundled in the device, that's allowed. You don't have to cost allocate for that. I don't know just how far that goes, but they talk broadly about software, again, filtering, security in that context. So I think they're just saying, look, we're going to give you $400 for that bundled device. And if there's a lot of great additional things on there, more power to you.
Right. And so the key there is that it's essentially on the invoice, there's a SKU that represents the whole thing, as opposed to 16 line items, one of which says device, because if it turns out it's a $269 Chromebook, and then you got a bunch of other line items, they're just going to key in on that $269 line.
Yeah.
But if it says, Chromebook bundle, and then, $612, you'll get your 400.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
That's a great explanation. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that's an important nuance then as you work with your vendors then to make sure that they actually have a bundled SKU. I think the vendors are probably pretty aware of this, that they know, well, if you're using ECF funds, you want our ECS fund bundle, as opposed to, let me give you a bunch of, a la carte items, which then clearly are not a device.
Right.
Right. Okay, good. And then, so we are, the round two that kind of prompted our conversation today, that opened up just 2 days ago, closes in less than 2 weeks, October
13th. Yeah. So it's really a short window.
A pretty short window. And so of course, round one then closed. And then I believe they refer to it as wave one notifications have gone out. So what do we know happened in round one? And does that give us any insights into what we might do in round two?
Yeah, so about $5 billion was requested in round one. The agency, the FCC, announced that they've approved already about 20% of those applications, which is pretty fast, that USAC has approved them. I think we'll see more application approvals very soon, but one thing that was reported by the FCC is that a huge, kind of number of devices were requested. And I was trying to find the exact number. I thought I had written it down here, I think in the kind of neighborhood of about 5 million connection. I'm sorry, I did find it. 5.4 million broadband connections and about 9.1 million devices. So that's requested. That's not just approved. But my guess is that most of that $5 billion will eventually be approved, probably with some exceptions. So, clearly a big bet being made on the device side. I think anecdotally, I've heard some districts say that. There were concerns in some districts about renewal funding for, when the program runs out and that kind of thing. So I think some places maybe leaned a little heavier on the devices, but, clearly 5.4 million connections is nothing to sneeze at.
Yeah. And so you said, so they've been pretty quick about getting this first wave of approvals out, which in some sense, not that we can guarantee this, but in my mind, if things are moving pretty swiftly, it also then means probably that not that they're not putting scrutiny on the applications, but that it is a pretty streamlined process. They're trying to keep it simple, trying not to create a gotcha, so that people get in trouble. And the nice thing is, again, it's you're requesting funds and then you get approval and then you go do something with it, as opposed to the other way around. Now, is this application in any way retroactive? Like if you bought something this summer, can your application reference that purchase, or is it only for something that happens in the future, or is that a level of detail?
That's a good question. So the program rules gave the FCC a lot of sort of flexibility. But what they elected to do with both round one and round two was focus on, I kind of refer to it as forward-looking investment. So the window for the purchases contemplated by these windows is sort of began on July 1st of this summer and looks forward, kind of a couple of years. It is possible that if they have enough money left to do a third round or a fourth round, that they might also look back before July 1st of this year to the beginning of the pandemic. They reserved the power to do that, to reimburse for those costs that were incurred across the country during that period of virtual learning at scale. But for right now, we're looking from July 1st of this summer forward.
Excellent. Okay. And it sounds like probably my gut tells me that there's going to be enough applications that's going to use up this entire 7 billion, which, and again, I think for context, for those of you who don't track the numbers, because we don't usually hang out at schools and talk about things with a B, the billions, but I think that the traditional annual allocation for E-rate is in the order of around 2.25, right, billion.
That was the number for many years. The cap on E-rates up above 4 billion now.
Up 4 now, okay.
Yeah, if demand gets that high. In recent years, it's been a little lower than that, but the FCC finally got around to giving a little bit more money to the program.
But as it is, though, this program began at over 7, in which case, so this was a significant amount of money from what we typically have seen. So I think really a great opportunity for schools to be looking at how they serve their students, and particularly because even in today's day and age, we're still seeing, I know in our state in Vermont, a number of schools that have been challenged by kind of COVID related issues and having to go back and forth between remote and back to in-person and back to remote. And so trying to make sure that everybody has both connectivity, has access devices, so on and so forth. So I don't know, scroll through here real quick if there's other questions that have been popping up. Christine's been throwing in some information down there. So I guess while I throw it out to all of you, if you've got any questions, please feel free to either throw them in the chat, or you could even just turn on your camera and join us here. But also, while they're thinking, Reg, are there other issues that we didn't really cover that you think we should make sure people know about?
Yeah, so I thought of one, which is one question that comes up a lot is, can I build out my own network? That was something that COSIN fought pretty hard for, but didn't fully win. So what the FCC said is, if a household's in an area where there's not service, you can do that. So it's a very high bar. You have to sort of provide evidence that it's an unserved location. So, if you happen to be joining us today from a very isolated rural area where you might have some of those houses, and you are ambitious and want to set up your own LTE network in partnership with someone or on your own, that opportunity is there. But again, it's a very kind of narrow one, and you've really got to show that that's areas in fact unserved. I see a question here, Jeff, from Trey about, he says, if we submitted in round one, but we're not part of the first wave of awards, do we need to reapply? Trey, the answer to that's no. So, they've approved 20% and they wanted to show progress in processing the applications. They're still working their way through the other 80%. So unless you've heard no for some reason, your application would still be pending from window one.
Okay, so yeah, so that's a good clarification that this first wave of approvals was not simply, it was not the end of approvals. It's just simply that rather than get the whole thing done and then make an announcement 6 weeks from now, they wanted to make sure, get something out the door so that so people could start to move. And I think given the global constraints on parts and availability of equipment and whatnot, probably the sooner the orders start getting placed on a rolling basis, the better anyway, because the system can't handle $7 billion of orders all at once. Even if we would like it to. I don't think anyone can handle that. Not even some of the big players. There's just not enough ships and not enough chips. So.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, absolutely. Luke, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. So just allow me like a minute to. So this sounds awesome. And I know I'm struggling a little bit with, we're a building-based one-to-one. Devices aren't going home right now. And I'm just trying to work myself through filling out an application. Can I confirm that there's a home component to these devices? The devices should be left at home? Should they be taken back and forth each day?
Yeah, they can be. I'm sorry, that's what you're asking. Actually, the commission has gotten that question a lot. And they've said in the FAQ that it's fine to take those connected devices to the school. They're, aiming to connect households, but recognizing these devices, have kind of educational uses, both on and off campus. So that is allowed.
And then in terms of, so our district is a little bit, I think we're pretty funded well. So I'm seeing some other districts in our state, and they have some probably holes that they're looking to fill. We don't have necessarily those big holes to fill. So I guess I'm also struggling with what is a reasonable amount to request. We had probably 500 or 600 students request a device last year during remote learning. So the devices would travel back and forth during hybrid. So I was thinking of using that survey, those results, and I guess I'm struggling with, last year was kind of a one-off situation. So would I go forward with the 500 or so students and put that on the application? I'm fearful of sending out another survey to families and kind of, depending on how it's worded, either having more people, because I'm sure I could word the survey in a way that all of our students would request one. And I'm sure I could word it in a way where, because there's no income limitations, but I'm sure I could word it in a way where we'd have only 100 requested. So is any guidance on just this kind of struggle of, we're about 2,300 kids. We don't need the devices. I would like to support students at home who need a device. I could just request the 500. I feel like I could request half of that and be safe. But am I missing an opportunity here to maybe allow devices to go home at the high school level that we haven't allowed before? Like, is this kind of like, I don't know. Sorry to ramble, but I'm really struggling with this.
So you have devices at the building in a one-to-one level now,
Yes, they all stay in the building.
and they all stay in the building.
Yeah,
And you actually have enough devices to give every student a device but just simply at the school.
correct. Yeah.
I mean, honestly, if you have the devices, my gut tells me that you just need to let them go home and not necessarily buy another device, one for the home and one for the school.
Sure. So
Right.
in that situation, politely, I have the federal government changing my entire one-to-one approach because of a grant proposal. So you're right. So right now, there is no massive desire for third graders to bring home their Chromebook back and forth each day. So it's kind of this catch-22. I mean, we're really comfortable with devices being in the building. There's some students who need a device at home that we don't necessarily allow them to bring them back and forth. We issue them kind of an older one off the pile device that they would leave at home. So you're right, though. I do see that, like,
Yeah.
I don't want us to be 2-to-1.
Right. Yeah. Because I
But
think
there's a certain-
it sounds to me like if you got stuck in a situation where you were going into the remote learning mode because school had to be shut down, you would send them home as needed, as requested, because you have the equipment, and at least it would allow you to continue to serve the students.
Correct.
It's
That is
more a
correct.
question, what you're looking at is in your face-to-face, in-person mode, some students don't have one at home, or at least they say they don't have good access to one. And can you use this to kind of fill that in?
Sure. Well, and that's the thing. If there's, so I'm acknowledging,
Yeah.
there's a couple hundred kids that could probably use the device in our district. There is no, there's no limiting principle of an income restriction or some type of state reporting data that I can rely on.
Yeah.
So another survey would entice everyone to either say, sure, we'll take a device, and there's no way to check on that. But I think if I use last year's number, I think I might just settle on a couple hundred to support students at home. They would leave the device at home, and then students would be 1-to-1 when they come into the building. No wear and tear on the device coming back and forth.
Yeah.
Does that sound okay?
I mean, I think if your longstanding policy is that those devices belong only on campus, that you have an argument to make. I can't say with certainty how they would respond to that. And I think, honestly, if you can provide an explanation that's logical for the 200, that's getting to the best estimate concept that they have put out. I don't want to totally cop out on the answer to this. There is a helpline just for this program. It might be interesting just to reach out to them and explain that the district policy has always been that these devices are anchored to the campus.
I mean, just by policy, it's an informal policy where there's a cutoff where a second grader, we don't want the devices coming back and forth 5 days a week.
Yeah.
And then maybe 5th or 6th grade, you probably could do it, but we're a district who has some devices at home, so we don't need the device to go back and forth with the majority of kids. But if this is strictly to help, close the homework gap, I mean, we have a couple hundred devices we could request.
Yeah.
So maybe that's it. But do you have the number? Do you mind sharing? And then I'll.
Oh yeah, I can find it.
If you don't mind, okay.
Put it in the chat.
Yeah.
Okay.
What I would also say is, I would reach out to them and in your application, be pretty transparent about what you're trying to do, because they very well, as Reg said, you have an argument to make. They may approve it. What I would advise you not to do, and this is just me speaking as kind of former bureaucrat, is to put in an application that doesn't really give them transparent understanding of what it is you're trying to do, because the optics could end up not looking good for you guys, later, because there's always some congressman out there who has an axe to grind about these kinds of programs, and who will then all of a sudden highlight you saying, well, look at this district who's an upper middle income district who had enough devices, and yet they bought more.
I mean,
right?
Jeff, that's when you look at the existing first wave of, I just received, I don't know, probably 15 to 20 Massachusetts school districts
Yeah.
I mean, they're already getting the money, at least on that list. So
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't need to mention the districts, but there's some districts of ample means that are getting 6 figures worth of devices and internet. So I don't know how.
You know, but of course, the other thing to remember is in any district, even the wealthy, affluent areas, it's not uncommon to not have devices for your younger students. A lot of schools don't have one-to-one programs, at least pre-pandemic, K-6. And, but when remote learning hits, you need it. And so it wouldn't surprise me if some districts that people normally associate with as being a kind of high income area making these requests, because in a remote scenario, it's necessary. You know, but again, that's, I think, what the application process is for, to just be transparent. You give it to them, and, you know, and hopefully it's approved and you're able to leverage it.
Thank you for that. I appreciate it.
I just pasted the hours and the phone number in the chat.
There you go. Any other questions from anyone in the group? All right, I think that's the 8 seconds of obligatory silence. So let me again thank you, Reg, for joining us today and sharing some of your wisdom and experience on these policy issues. Sometimes it can be more difficult than we think for the average person who doesn't spend a lot of time with federal programs to kind of sift through the language. Yeah. It's often worded in weird ways and certain buzzwords that mean things to people who hang out in policy, but not to the rest of us. So I think it's really helpful to hear from you on this. And again, we will, I've been recording this, and so I will post the recording back to the Vita-Learn website, along with, I'll have the chat there. So I know that there are some links there. I'll have a copy of some slides that Reg has that had links out to a number of different documents, like the FAQ documents and whatnot. And also I have a recording that I'll add to that is actually by the CETA organization that did a walkthrough of the actual digital application. So if you really need the kind of nuts and bolts, what does it mean when it gets to question 6 or something, they've kind of done a walkthrough of the application, and that can hopefully help you as well. So again, you've only got 2 weeks to do this, but I think it's, you know, if you have some unmet needs, it's worth putting together and putting an application and hopefully getting the funding. And for those of you in Vermont, as I wrote in the emails inviting you to this, you know, we as a state asked for something like less than 1/10 of 1% of the funding that was requested in round 1. So there's a kind of a disproportionate share of the money's not coming to Vermont. And so maybe we should take a look at what we're doing, because I know we've got a lot of rural areas in the state that are not very well served with broadband and whatnot, and families who could really take advantage of that. So thanks again, Reg, for joining us, and thank all of you for coming. And if you have questions, you know how to find me, Jeff at vitalearn.org. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody. See you.
All right. Bye-bye.